Welcome to The Backstory, a special series from Future of Faith. In each episode, we take a look behind the scenes of projects from the National Storytelling Initiative on Christian Faith and Life. We'll be pulling back the curtains on our own work, sharing the wins and the struggles, and inviting others on to do the same. We're going to learn from each other and build this community together. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Backstory. As you know, over this entire podcast, we have been interviewing grantees who have received a storytelling grant in this Lilly storytelling ecology ecosystem, what have you. And these interviews have been fascinating. But we've been thinking lately, too, that we want to also weave in some voices of experts, people who are not grantees, but just have something to offer the field of storytelling or to this to these grantees in particular, ourselves included. I mean, people that this is largely how we identified them as like, who do we want to learn from in an interview? And so occasionally throughout the series, we're going to continue to hear from grantees, but we're also going to be dropping in these interviews with experts. We have the first one of those today in this episode, and it's with Nancy Ammerman. And Nancy is, one of the leading sociologists of religion of the last, 30, 40 years. I can't remember exactly when she started. She's officially retired now, but still very much active in the field, and was a huge inspiration to me as I was getting my PhD and going into the work of being a professional sociologist and trying to figure out what that meant, especially one who dealt with religion. And I've adored her work for a very long time. In particular, she is the sort of one of the leaders of developing this concept of everyday or lived religion and what that means and how people do that on a daily basis and how do we theorize about it, et cetera. One of my favorite books that she ever wrote is this book called Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. And that's what sort of forms the conversation that I got to have with her. I was really excited. It was like a professional highlight for me to get to have this. So we'll listen to that, and then all three of us will come back and talk about what we learned. Nancy, it's so great to have you here on the podcast. I mean, you are like one of the most influential people for me as a social scientist, but also it's like you've had such an enormous influence on the field. And I think, one of the most compelling reasons to have you as a guest here is not just because I want to talk to you, but because the storytelling ecosystem is not filled with social scientists and sociologists, and it shouldn't be probably. Like that's not really what the grant is for. But we could all benefit, I think, so much from at least hearing a bit more about how sociologists have approached this kind of work, because we are collectors of stories. We often call it just qualitative data, but the best of what we're doing is getting people to tell a narrative from beginning to end, often for the first time. I mean, I know I've seen that in my own work, and that is a story of its own. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time in retirement to be on our podcast.
Well, as my husband says, I'm only not really completely retired. So it's really fun to be here and have a chance to talk with you about this, because I care a lot about this whole storytelling business. And you've already alluded to one of the reasons I find it so important to ask storytelling questions when I'm doing research, especially with people of faith,
Mm.
is that they often haven't been asked to tell stories. It's really remarkable how often you leave an interview and somebody says, "Nobody's ever asked me that before."
Nobody's ever asked me that. Yeah, I hear that. I mean, you're right. That is very remarkable. And like, so you've done that so often. I mean, you've had a chance to sit, figuratively or literally across the table and ask people these questions that they've never asked. And I think that's what a lot of people in this initiative are going to be facing. Like, we have all been thinking about stories as almost these like uninterrupted narratives from beginning to end, but really people think about their lives in these episodes, and then we sit down and ask them to like stitch them together.
Yeah.
How is your experience doing that around religion? You know, are people grateful for that? Like, what are some of the challenges that you've seen? Can you just talk a little bit about trying to get people to
Yeah.
sort of stitch all that together into one?
Well, can I back up a bit and talk a little theory?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. I got really interested in the whole storytelling business um, around theories of narrative Um, and that's the way social scientists tend to talk about storytelling is talking about narratives. And I came to understand that our very understanding of who we are uh, is embedded in a whole multi-layered series of narratives. We can start with just the episode, the narrative of, I got up early this morning and I turned on Zoom and I met with Josh, and that narrative has a beginning, middle, and end.
Hmm.
It has a why. It has a characters. It has setting. Here we are on Zoom. So it has all of the elements of a story. And in some sense, our lives are made up of all of those episodes. But we're also lodged within some other recognizable stories that shape how we tell that story. We're lodged within institutional stories um, that you referred to me as retired. Well, that presumes, an academic institution that
Hmm.
I've been affiliated with that has a beginning, middle, and end of a career
Yeah.
um, that you know I'm I didn't invent that. I lived into it as a story that was kind of already there, but my presence in it has ever so slightly perhaps altered how the institution exists. Because all of this is continually stories really don't have endings. They they simply become part of a continuing story. And we're also lodged within stories that are resident in our cultures, both subcultures and big cultures. That there's a story about being an academic white woman in the United States of America at this moment, and that culture that I'm a part of is a part of my story.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that I try to listen for when I'm asking people to to tell me stories about an episode is how that episode is lodged in these other layers of story.
Mm.
And that's my job, really. Although sometimes, as an analyst, as an interpreter,
Right.
uh, but sometimes it becomes interesting to bring that directly into the conversation and ask people to tell you stories about times when they, for instance, really recognized what it was to be a white woman,
Hmm.
or a time when they really recognized what it was to live in an academic institution or a church. Um, so, it, one of my favorite ways to ask the questions is to ask, "Tell me about a time when," uh, which is invites people not to say, "What do you believe about?"
Yeah.
Um, or "Tell me what it means to you to be X, Y, or Z in some, big thing."
Hmm.
But, identify a particular time and place, and then unpack that whole story. Where were you?
Yeah.
What did it look like? What did it smell like? How did it start? How did it end? What were the consequences?
And that's like, I mean, what I'm hearing you talk about is this like our knowledge of the stories that people are embedded in because of their social location or their structures or whatever, like they can talk to us about an episode in their life, and then we can bring to it that knowledge of how we see them positioned to help unfold a deeper or more meaningful thing. I mean, I think this is, a lot of your career was devoted to working in this inside of this concept of lived religion, and what does it mean for people to have a sort of everyday kind of faith that is embedded in all of these structures that maybe they don't even have always sacred or religious language for, but are sacred and spiritual moments.
Yeah, and people are pretty, they've been trained to think, "Oh, I don't take religion to work."
Hmm.
Yeah. Or, my religion doesn't affect my health.
Yeah.
So you really have to start by asking people, "Well, tell me about what you understand to be sacred or spiritual.
Hmm.
Uh, what are the times when you have experienced something beyond yourself? When you've encountered God?" Probe for the way they talk about their faith, uh, so that they begin to have an opportunity to talk experientially rather than just, doctrinally.
Hmm. So, in my experience, asking people these kinds of questions about faith, they get they can get very defensive very quickly because it seems like to me it seems like they feel like they should have answers for things that they don't. And so when you start saying, like, what was a religious moment, and if they can't produce it, but they feel like they should, it kind of shuts down that conversation. I mean, uh, how do we get people to, we might see a sacred, like we may see them describing a moment that we would call sacred or religious, or we want to unpack
Yeah.
that story. How do we do that in a way that doesn't make them defensive? Then, because a lot of people feel very uncomfortable, like they feel like they're not prepared or the expert enough, to talk about these things.
Yeah. Yeah, that may be an advantage that a social scientist has over a pastor or somebody who's actually, in some sense, representing a religious institution or tradition, because we can come in and say, there really are no right answers here.
Right.
Um, no, I really want to hear how you experience things and begin the conversation at uh, as broad a level as you possibly can. That opens up as much as you possibly can open up to allow people to imagine what what it is that they might, in fact, name as sacred, even though they're not in the habit of naming it as sacred.
Yeah.
Uh, so asking those questions about, moments of wonder and awe and mystery and, uh, when were times that you encountered something that just made you feel like you were, uh, in the right place at the right time?
Mm.
Or, a time when you felt like you had tapped into some power you didn't know you had?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
there are all sorts of ways of asking those questions in more generic language that uh, that religious leaders probably don't naturally use. Uh, the religious leaders have a whole vocabulary that they can use to describe these things that the people they're talking to may or may not.
Yeah. One of the things I'm picking up on and what you're saying is another, like, a little trick that I sort of stumbled into when I was doing research. Was early in my career, I would ask people, like, tell me when you felt closest to God, or, like, when did you experience the most awe? And I realized people were stumbling in their responses because they were trying to find, I essentially asked them a right or wrong answer by asking the closest or most, right?
Yeah.
And instead, the way that
Just
you're offering
same
is,
time.
yes, exactly. Like, what's a
Yeah.
time? Because you
Yeah.
don't really need the most, I mean, most of the
Yeah.
time. I mean, and you can work your way into that if you need to.
Yeah.
But that's a really helpful reminder. You mentioned a lot of these, like, terms that are sort of in the bubble of sacred experiences, and we can talk about wonder and awe and transcendence. Ho how have you seen people's language or their facility, their ability to engage in this conversation? How has that changed over time, as you've been doing this work? I mean, are there terms that they're more and less comfortable with, or conversations that you found, like, oh, that conversation doesn't work anymore? People don't have the, sort of grammar, quote unquote, for this.
I don't know that I've seen it so much in my own research, um, partly because the last time I was really in the field was almost 20 years ago
Sure.
now. So, um, But if we look at the larger, uh, survey data, we know that, nearly 40% of young adults in the US don't identify with a religious tradition.
Hmm.
And we know that, most of those, or a growing number of them, didn't grow up with any, religious tradition. It's not so much that they've, left something behind. They just simply never had it, which
Yeah.
means they don't have the kind of traditional religious vocabulary, uh, to talk about these things. Many of them like to think of themselves as spiritual. They'll say they're spiritual but not religious.
Hmm.
Oh, and for me, that's an entry point, to say,
Hmm.
what does that mean for you? To say that you're spiritual? Um, are there things you do or things you experience that that are part of how you understand what it is to be spiritual? So then again, listening for their vocabulary in order to probe more,
Yeah.
because they very well may not have any of the traditional religious vocabulary, and they may have their own invented meanings for some of these things.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about like stories embedded in stories. It's a person choosing to use the word spiritual takes on a different context in this world where people don't sort of by default, there's sort of a lack of trust or maybe even a mistrust around religious institutions and religion, capital R. And so a lot of the things that maybe people would have said, I'm religious now, they want to be like, well, hold on, I don't want to, ascribe to an entire set of beliefs. So I'll just use this word spiritual. And also sometimes spiritual doesn't mean religious at all. I mean, it feels like a whole new landscape to try and unpack.
Yeah.
The You One of my favorite books is your in the sociology of religion is Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes, and I love what the approach of that book of really trying to understand the way that people carry these sacred stories and narratives with them throughout all parts of their lives, and then like then construct them and further like reify them in not in more than just religious settings. And then how that reinforces their sense of belonging to these groups in a variety of places. Can you just talk for people who might not know that book? Now it's a little bit older, and so I'm not holding it up as like empirical evidence that all these storytellers need to go and read as much anymore as I am about the approach.
Yeah. Um, well, the approach really was, a narrative methodology. We wanted to get people to tell us stories. And so we adopted a number of different methods, to give people, different kinds of opportunities to
Hmm.
tell stories. So we started with, a kind of life history interview, that really was framed as tell me about your growing up, tell me about your work, tell me about your family, you know, uh, have you been involved in any religious or institutions or traditions over your lifetime? Those kind of, big, let's get the autobiography kind of story
Yeah.
conversation. Uh, then we also gave them digital recorders and gave them a series of prompts, questions to think about, or suggested ways they might simply, through the course of their day, tell us stories about what was going on. So people, gave would like take the digital recorder with them in the car while they drove to work,
Hmm.
uh, or have it in the kitchen while they're cooking dinner or whatever, and just would tell stories about what happened today.
Hmm.
We really wanted to try to get as close to, what's happening right now, uh, as we could. And we also gave them, it's long enough ago, we gave them disposable cameras.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
now we would have just said, use your phone.
Right.
Uh, uh, and the instruction was take pictures of the places that are important to you. We can say sacred places or whatever.
Mm.
They could say why those places were important. And so after they gave us back the cameras, we got the pictures developed and went back and we would, lay the pictures out on the table and say, okay, arrange these in whatever way you want to arrange them and tell us the stories of why these places. So between the big story life history interview and the what's happening right now in my everyday life conversations and the pictures, people had a chance to tell us a lot of stories about just everyday stuff. And then it was our job to listen to those stories. And having asked them in that first interview how they would define spiritual, we could then, listen for and watch for where that spiritual piece
Mhm.
showed up in the other things that we were doing with them.
And as I've gotten a chance to learn and from like about more of these projects and hear people, I mean, even our own storytelling project that we have at Future Faith, it's a um, we're mostly, I would say, most of us doing this work are thinking about it's for those of us who are gathering stories. We're thinking about gathering stories as a one shot deal. Like we're either through a variety of mediums. I've been impressed by the sort of the breadth of ways that people are thinking about doing this. But what I think is so rich about what you're describing is that you're sort of building one off of the other. You're with these people over a period of time. Again, it's from interview to then their own sort of private-ish thoughts to then a combination of those two where they're taking photos by themselves, but then you're processing them together. Why does that like what is so powerful about that? Why not just like pick the one that works best and go with just the
Yeah.
interviews or just the photos?
Well, one of the things that clearly happened was that people came to sense that they had a relationship with the person who was interviewing them
Mhm.
and who was working with them through the whole project. Uh, by the time they were doing the recordings, um, they would essentially do it as if they were talking to the researcher,
Mm.
as if it were a phone conversation almost. You know, hey Amy, you know, here's here's what's happening right now. Uh, uh, so that building up of relationship and trust, I think, is really important in helping people to be willing to dig a little deeper with what they're willing to say and bring to light stories that they might not otherwise be willing to bring to light.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And maybe like it's I don't know, you could argue back and forth about whether this is a good or a bad thing, but it also activates their imagination for I mean, what I find is that, it's people do all we do all kinds of things. When you sit down to try and talk about it, you leave out stuff that might like you don't think is important, or it's just, you're trying to get to the, beginning, middle, end of the story if you're even telling it in a narrative format. Um and hitting them, I mean, using those multimodalities. I mean, I don't need for everybody to become a methodologist, but just that simple thing of thinking, if you were to talk to them more than once,
Hmm.
what might you do and how might that change the kinds of stories that you're collecting and the ways that you're engaging with them? It builds trust, it gets them to go deeper. And I think that really comes through in the book for sure, and in the ways that you're describing that.
Do you know Roman Williams and his PhotoVoice project?
Yeah,
Yeah.
say more.
Yeah. Well, Roman was on the team that was part of the research team for the Sacred Stories book. And uh, he was the, well, we sort of, if we're talking about, could we use photos in some way?
Mhm.
And didn't really know any. any research that used photos. There was a little bit here and there, and we actually read some stuff like from medical sociology
Yep.
and from epidemiology. They were using stories to try to figure out what was going on. Why the kid with asthma isn't getting better.
Hmm.
Uh, but um, Roman really uh, took this whole project on and became very convinced that uh, cameras were a very good research tool, and has since begun a project and a consulting business, basically, that he uses what he calls PhotoVoice,
Hmm.
which uh, is intended to allow people uh, not to narrate their lives, but especially to narrate their lives across religious differences and other kinds of differences. So people are uh, talking about the places that are important to them in the context of conversations that help them bridge those differences.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm a subscriber to his newsletter. I know him a little bit. The Interfaith Photo Voice is the website for the people who are listening, and it's really it is he has really taken that to the next level. I mean, I distinctly remember, trying to read as much about visual sociology as I could when I was a graduate student in 2006, or
Yeah,
so. And
that's about
right,
when it was beginning to come
yeah,
in.
like I could read literally everything there was because there
Yeah,
wasn't that much.
yeah.
He has been key in sort of helping push that
And
forward.
he
It
to
helps.
edit or co-edited a book on visual sociology of religion. So people watching this podcast might find some of those articles useful.
Yeah, and there's some important methodological and ethical things to understand, but it's not like it's insurmountable. I mean, people who are non-specialists could easily learn some key
Absolutely.
things about storytelling,
Yeah.
implement. Well, all of this then, Nancy, I mean, these are not, again, not social scientists. We're all about to be drowning in stories at some level. Um, so, and you have, I mean, even back before, some of this was digitized, you've got stacks
Uh,
of
we
paper.
still had to transcribe this stuff.
Exactly. What are some pieces of advice you would give for people who are dealing with, it's not a database like, an Excel document or, an SPSS file or whatever, where you can just type in some code and have it spit out a regression for you. You've got just, pages and pages and pages of stuff. Um, how do you cut through all that to find the stuff that matters? I mean, we're ultimately all going to be telling stories that we want to move the needle in some way. So it's not an analysis, but we also want our work to be true. And so we do want to find some common themes.
Well, the way a social scientist comes at this is it assisted by software
Hmm.
that helps us. And I don't pretend to understand how an AI assistant might actually help um, in doing the kind of searching of your text that you want to do. I'd say somebody needs to do a session on training of
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But the way we have typically done this is to to use a software package like In Vivo or Atlas TI, or there are various of these software packages where you put all the text in, so you're still working with mountains and mountains of text, uh, but it gives you a way to go through, and if you've got if you got specific research questions or just insight questions that you want to try to attack, search for phrases and words that may be the clues to here's somebody talking about that, and highlighting those things, attaching some sort of a code so you can find it again,
Hmm.
find all of the things that you have tagged with that code. Here's somebody talking about finding God in nature. Uh, and here are all the places now where people have talked about finding God in nature. And what can I see when I look at all of those kind of sequentially about, oh, it's really just women who do that, or,
Mhm.
it's the Presbyterians who do that, oh, or, what are the things that I need to pay attention to about the perhaps the similarities and differences about where those kinds of stories happen, uh,
Mhm.
that will help me figure out that, there are some people who aren't telling stories like this. So why are they not telling stories like this? Is there something that we need to think about in the way of invitation or intervention that invites those kinds of stories from people like this?
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's that kind of sorting, tagging and sorting, that
Yeah.
a
I
scientist
think
does. When we would do it, we would wanna be really comprehensive, going
Mhm.
through and finding everything there is to find in this mass of text. I think for your purposes, you can be much more targeted,
Mhm.
uh, in saying, there's something I think I've seen or heard in the storytelling. Let me go through and see if I've actually, seen and heard it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, like, there is no magic wand for it. I mean, part of the answer to, like, how do you deal with the mounds of text is that you get into the mounds of text. I mean,
Exactly.
it that
Yeah.
that always I mean, you're right, software helps, but, I remember, again, early in my career thinking, like, "There's gotta be a shortcut." There's no shortcut.
Nope.
Uh, and again
And it is the human brain. I mean, AI may
yeah.
help find things, perhaps help summarize or condense things, but it's the human brain that's gonna have to look at those stories and notice things.
Mhm. Mhm. Another tool that I'll toss out that I would say to all my graduate students, and then they would summarily disregard until after the project is over, and they said, "I should have done that," is memoing. And so part of the qualitative research process is a strong, and quantitative too, but less so. Um, is when you're in the field, when you're collecting, when you have an idea, you hear something, or something sparks a thought, is to take the time to sit down and just jot out a note. And ideally, that note should, if you can get it to link to other thoughts, or it can, if you can um, refer to whatever it was that sparked that idea for you, so much the better. But
Yeah.
those memos become really key for me in terms of assembling later the context that goes around why a particular quote or story or an approach might be really useful, because you're going to be swimming in information. And if you're, if you're my age, like, you can't hold it all in your head. You got to get it down.
Oh,
And it feels so salient and real when you're sitting there talking to somebody that you're like, I'll never forget this. And the question isn't whether you'll forget it, because you probably won't. The question is, will you remember it when the time comes that you want to be able to remember it? And that's sort of half the battle. Well, Nancy, just on a last note here, we're all telling these stories. There's going to be, there's even more storytelling projects coming, as I understand it. Is there a story about American Christianity right now that you feel like, boy, I wish more people would tell this story? This is what I see coming up, and nobody's really paying attention to it in the way that it should, and it's really happening sort of on from the ground up, maybe even, and that's why sort of scholars might be missing it. Or is there just an angle that you think would be really beneficial for us to uplift?
it's a really hard question. I think the thing that frustrates me the most about American Christianity right now is that there is this large population of people, disproportionately younger people, but not just younger people, whose picture of Christianity is white Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
It is this punitive, strict, uh, sort of, and often abusive form of Christianity that they, first of all, they know very little about in
Mhm.
terms of actually knowing what the tradition is, but what they see, they want nothing to do with.
Yeah.
And it frustrates me that churches that aren't like that have such a hard time getting their message out,
Hmm.
telling the stories of their faith, and invite and listening, finding forums, finding places to listen to the kind of seeking, nascent, wish we could kind of faith that might be out there
Yeah.
among those people who think they could never find it in a church.
Yeah. But they can. They
They
can
can.
find it in a church. Well,
Yeah.
that's such a good word. Thank you for that. It's a real encouragement because I would count our own project in this space of like, you know, whether implicitly or explicitly trying to counter that dominant narrative, both for the fact that that narrative about white Christian nationalism is, as you express, I think often toxic and inaccurate, but also it's never good to have one dominant narrative. There are always a multitude of stories out there, and we can tell. Like you're right, like this whole other, I wouldn't even say side, but this whole other aspect dimension is sort of not cutting through the noise, and I think there are a lot of projects I know of in the works that can hopefully do that. And so it's really encouraging to hear you seeing the same thing. Well, thank you so much for
Can I
this.
say one more thing?
Oh, please do. Yeah, go for it.
I would love to see a really lively TikTok series that that came out of a project like yours, where people are essentially doing testimonies,
Hmm.
but testimonies on TikTok.
Yeah.
Um, here's where I encountered God today.
Well,
Um, here's how
that
my life has changed because I'm a part of a community that has this faith. Yeah.
well, that's
Anyway,
coming. I mean, that's really. I'm glad to know Nancy Ammerman is on TikTok. That makes me very happy.
I'm actually not, but I think I should be.
Well, and I think that there are a lot of plans. I think social media is a big part of the dissemination plan for a lot of these, including again our own work. So that's
Yeah.
well, I'm very hopeful that we can, yeah, it's not these things are not just going to live on blogs and sort of you know old media, but really get local and get granular with folks. So, well, again, thank
But
you so much. I appreciate the
oh,
time. It's
it's
super
been
great to hear
fun.
from you,
Yeah.
and we will keep you updated on this as it
All
goes.
right.
Hi, everybody, welcome back from the interview. Shannon, Elizabeth, you got a chance to hear it. Obviously, I've been familiar with Nancy's work for a long time, so I'm really curious to get your sort of first thoughts. I mean, maybe this isn't your first encounter with her, but maybe it's maybe your deepest or something, and certainly the one that's most applied to storytelling. So, what'd you think?
It was my first encounter with her, and I loved getting to hear her perspective, especially, I think, you know, Josh, the way you think about story evaluation or just the world challenges my own because I do not think the way you do. And so it was so good to hear you in conversation with her. And I thought, oh gosh, wow, it's so meaningful to look at the world, look at story, look at an interview through that lens. I was trained in a very different style of interview for a very different purpose. And so I learned so much listening to her talk about how she frames questions, how she thinks about the space that she's creating for people to be expansive, and the assumptions we make about the questions we're asking that actually are limiting people's imaginations for the stories they can or get to tell in a moment. So, so good. Really appreciated it.
No, I agree with you, Elizabeth. Like the ability, like even, and I think this has been a theme from even way back to the conversation with Chris Leach. Like the way we ask the questions, it limits or expands people's imagination and ability to tell the stories they have in them to tell, right?
Hmm.
And I love the way she talked about like narrative methodology, but I love where she went from there, which was to this multimedia approach, layered to just the narrative. Um, and just the role of photography. And so I had not heard about PhotoVoice before the what is it? Interfaith PhotoVoice,
Well,
Roman.
so if you don't know Robin Williams' Interfaith Photo Voice, you should. I mean, I think I'm not just you, Shannon, but I mean like everybody listening because it's really he does really great work there. And I like Rowan and I have had a lot of conversations and like keep like trying to find the right grant proposal to work on together. Um, and primarily what you'll see if you go to his website is this like interfaith approach, but that's not the only, like he will work in like Christian only spaces. And so if you're doing a project, like in one of these storytelling projects, you want to hire him to facilitate and lead a methodology for you, it'd be great. It's visual sociology goes back not that long. I mean, really, to the mid 80s or something when cameras started becoming really cheap, but visual sociology also encompasses like printed material. What this photo voice technique is incredibly interesting. And it's a lot of times it's used with populations that don't either have regular access to power or to people who will listen to them. So a lot of the early photo voice or photo elicitation things were pioneered with like children or patients in hospitals, um, uh, all kinds of vulnerable populations. I did a small project in graduate school with at the time the language we used was homeless population in Nashville, the unhoused population, really born out of like my own experience of working at a place that served meals and then hearing people say that there was a lack of access to resources, knowing that not like we always had more food to give out than people who came through. So I gave cameras to people, men in this case, who documented their trip around the city. And then we got together again. These are disposable cameras, had to go print them, get them back. And then they talked me through the photographs of like why these pictures were important to them and why they went to these places. And that's a really good example of how you can use photo voice in the construct of daily life to get pictures and images and talking points of things that people might not otherwise think to bring up in an interview or a focus group or in a story that you're asking them to produce from scratch. Um, and so, yeah, Roman does great work. I was not surprised that he was connected to her project. It's a really important methodology.
Yeah, I just love it. I mean, all that it reminds me of like Kids with Cameras, which was
Yep,
one of my big, when I started doing social impact work, it was one of the big kind of
absolutely.
use. Um, but also I do think it goes back we touched on this when we were talking about Laura Everett's interview. This like different mediums, right? Like the role of art and like photography is art, and how we don't just have to think in film or social media, but like still photography and layered image, and it has a big role to play. So I loved that. And I did love just how the questions you asked. And I feel like there was a good question that I wish she would have gone. um I think it was, I wish she could have gone further, I think, because she's not actively doing a lot in the space right now. But you asked, how has people's ability to have these conversations changed? And, um, and I think it has I think it's changed in the last 3 years. I think, and I wonder if we need to slow down a little bit to actually explore that. So
Okay, so this is one of the things I wanted to ask you all about. Is just like, what value do we get from this academic approach to interviewing and storytelling? So for me, one of the things that I have carried forward out of my academic world and into this more applied space is this like creative skepticism or generous skepticism. So if you listen to people talk when when they tell, especially when they're telling you a story that they're unsure about how it's going to be received, they'll often say things like they'll fill in a whole set of assumptions with the words like so like so it just everything seems just really tense, and the job as an academic interview, the way you're trained is to be like, no, I don't know. Tell me what you mean. Like, why was it tense? What did they do? Like, what did it make you feel? Who said what things? Like, it's to really dig into that level of detail. And I think we cannot be as like sort of confrontational about it in this world as we can be in the academic world, where you're still being kind. I mean, I think the best interviewers for projects would be still being kind, but you can ask more directly. Over here, but we have to unpack the like we have to unpack the assumptions. Did you find anything from like it? Because I think you're right, Shannon. It has changed, and I think people are going to be inclined to fill in when we ask them, like, tell your story about how you came to this congregation. Like, oh, a friend just invited me, and so then I just started showing up. And what we really want are the details of like, no, what did they say? Like, what were the circumstances in which they invited you? When did you show up? Like, did you immediately start going every week? If you like, we want to know all that stuff. So, did you find anything in Nancy that like helped you to get into the assumptions?
yeah, Well, I'll go and then you, Elizabeth. I think there were two things. I think she said, listen to their vocabulary.
Mhm.
Listen to their vocabulary. So even that, I had a friend that invited me. Well, what kind of friend? What do you mean by friend? Like, so, but listen to their vocabulary. And then she talked about it's not a one-time interview. That,
Right.
like, these were layers. So there's a depth of trust and that comes through being in relationship to get to the story, right? To get to the
Yeah.
learning. And I think that those were two very helpful things. I think that her work I think it's really important for everyone to hear. So,
I one thing I really respected it, like you were saying, their vocabulary, the way I've heard it said by two other folks who did interviews. One, my husband, who does oral histories all the time, but also I listen to Amy Poehler's Good Hangs podcast, and people have asked her how she's able to loop back around so well inside of her interviews. And they've both talked about it in this way. Mark, my husband, talks about it as like when people say something like, my friend invited me, he sees a spotlight. There was all darkness. He walks into an interview in his mind with all darkness, and he sees a spotlight turn on certain things as they begin saying it, and he only remembers those spotlighted moments, and he comes back and is like, "Tell me more about your friend. When did that relationship start?" Or because and
Oh,
he
that's
said,
so fascinating.
and
Just
Amy
that
Poehler says
visual of like
something.
how to make sense of that. Yeah.
Yes. Amy Poehler says something very similar in the way that she's able to make loops back around, but also what Mark talks about is he says it's a trauma informed, as a social worker, he was trained as a social worker. It's a trauma informed way of doing interviewing as well, because they have already said, I feel comfortable talking about
Mhm.
this thing. I'm not interrogating something, that you didn't name that my assumptions are leading me to believe actually are the story. It's like just like you said, Shannon. It's like, tell me more about that friend. There's already a slight permission to go there,
Mhm.
and so putting them in control of that stream of consciousness, instead of, and that is very different than how I was trained as a journalist.
Yeah.
And so I really respect that she lifted that up as, I think, not just strategic to get to a story, but caring for the person in front of you.
I used to talk about it with my students, and as like you have to have an interview guide, because our interview guides are informed by like what theory are we trying to build, or what empirical evidence are we trying to test. I mean, we're academics after all. We're trying to produce new knowledge, right? You have to have an interview guide. So you have to have some preset idea of what you're going to talk about, but you have to know that interview guide so well that you can forget it and let their words trigger. So it's interesting when you said, Mark, is like a spotlight, because I would always think about it like I was an English major, so I would think of it as like a sentence diagram. And
Mm.
whenever which I hated diagramming sentences, but like whenever somebody would say a word or a phrase that would map onto one of the questions on the interview guide, for me that would be like another branch, right? Like we could then go
Yeah.
off from that, and we could go off from that and go deeper from this. But you can't do that if you're just reading down the interview guide, like question one, question two. Like no matter what you say to question two, the next thing I'm going to say is question three. That I don't think that's I don't think it's good scholarship, which is not necessarily the point here. But I don't think it's very human and not like very generous.
Yeah, no, and so I would go into interviews because I had a direction I needed to go in writing a story, writing a news story where I'm like, I know the story is ultimately this, and I need you to prove that, basically. And that is like
Yeah.
so challenging, and then counter that like with Mark, he goes in with no questions.
Right.
He has no questions ever, like, plain. He has some that he knows work, but he doesn't go through questions. Also, he's an artist, and I'm super type A and he is not. So, like, there's some of that personality thing, but I do think that openness, then what is, I think, decenters the interviewer.
Yeah. Shannon, can I ask you? Okay, so one of the things that Nancy talked about is this like academic way of approaching the analysis. In other words, like it's sort of disembodying these quotes. This isn't the only way to do it, but the way that she has done it, and then like looking for themes across all this. She talked about tagging, et cetera, et cetera. As you think about building a campaign, like in some ways that's very attractive, right? Like here's all the quotes that that people say that talk about this thing. Like, but that also feels like very rigorous and, like I said, kind of disembodied. When she was talking about that, what did you think?
No, I love it. And to be honest, okay, again, I think you both know me. Like I'm super intuitive, right? So I have never done like a big coding project like that. But in our work that we're doing with TMF, like the work of ASHA, we have like they have done massive interviews with people in the field and um some different people who we think their voices matter on religion and um current social context and all of that. And they have then tagged it. And what we could see, both that resonated what we already thought we believed and what has challenged some of our
Mm,
assumptions, it is
Mm.
meaningful. And it is a research project.
yeah.
It's a different kind of research than our audience research that we're doing. But it's been very helpful to then try to get to how do we actually speak to this and what are the narrative arcs that are bubbling up from within these people who from these interviews which we really think have value. So I just think that a bit of tagging and I really believe that like social impact work and when it has academia and academic rigor like side by side with it, they both get better because your theory and your practice are more wedded together. If they both sit like this, if they're further apart, they don't really inform each other. You can have so to me, I really think there's value. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, that is because I mean, I know where I see the value because I've done, I've lived on both sides of this line, but I'm always curious about how non-academics feel when they hear stuff like that, if it feels too impersonal. Because for me, I think like at some level, $5 million each on a storytelling project buys you a lot of information. I mean, we're all going to be swimming in what I would call data. And how do you make sense of all that data that's going to be like just bombarding us? And in many ways, we're asking for. I mean, I think I've talked about on the show before. We just did a brief survey with some of our planning grant money, and we asked people to respond on video to 4 questions. Well, we were able to buy 50 responses, and so or something like that. So we've got hundreds of videos now that are 2 or 3 minutes long of people responding to questions. And our thought was like, some of this will be content, but how do you start to like find your way through? Even like we got that in 3 weeks, right? Like, let alone 5 years.
Well,
And so this idea of like tagging them, coding them, I think the concept is useful, even if we do want to keep more of the context than maybe academics would keep.
no, I think you're right. I think this is a real I mean you can't do everything. I feel like I think one of the dangers is when you have so many people, right? Like there's going to be 100 storytelling grants. Who's really looking across all of them to see what we're learning, to do that data work, right? Like we need that at an ecosystem level. I really believe that. And some of it's, I think about it from my evaluation, impact and evaluation work, right? Like only so that we all get better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we all know, but you're right. When there's so much, whose job is it to make sense of it and not just project by project, but as a whole?
Well, I agree. I think that work should be done, and Future Faith would be glad to do it. It would just take a contract. People know where to reach us. Well, Elizabeth, last word. Any final thoughts here from Nancy's interview?
Oh no, just so rich, so good. Thanks Josh for bringing her voice into this. I'm so grateful that everyone listening gets to partake.
Yeah, and it was fun for me to get to share that with an audience that maybe wouldn't have known Nancy's work. I mean, she obviously is well known to sociologists, but maybe not to all the practitioners. Well, look forward to more of these expert interviews. Like I said, we're going to start, especially over the summer, we're going to start sprinkling these in as the as more of the grantees work gets off the ground and we have, we give people a space to breathe and get something going. But we've got some really exciting stuff coming up. We were just talking before this about the slate of experts that are coming up. So thanks everybody for listening. Stay tuned. More to come.
You've been listening to the Backstory podcast. For all the episodes and more resources, head over to www.futureoffaith.org/storytelling.